They told me later that what I did was heroic, but the truth is I broke the CEO's direct order, and if I had waited for permission, the entire system would have gone dark. I still remember the exact moment Natalie Voss looked at me like I didn't exist. Her voice was calm, controlled, cold. No. Just one word, but it landed like a door slamming shut in my face. The room was full of executives, board members, engineers with titles long enough to fill business cards, and there I was, a contract technician standing near the wall like a piece of furniture. I should have stayed quiet. That would have been the safe choice. But the red warnings on the screen behind her were multiplying every second. I knew what they meant. I also knew something else. If they followed the plan Natalie had just approved, Astrocore was about to lose $1 billion contract, maybe more, and I would still have to explain to my 8-year-old daughter why I was late picking her up again, so I stepped forward. "Your reset won't fix it," I said quietly. For a moment, the entire operations room went silent, not because they were listening, because they were annoyed. Natalie Voss didn't even turn around at first. She just stared at the wall of monitors where the system errors were crawling upward in angry red lines. The main synchronization engine of Astrocore's new global trading platform was collapsing in real time. Every server rack in the room hummed louder than normal. Heat was rising, and the digital clock on the wall was counting down. 30 minutes. That was how long the company had before the launch failed in front of their biggest client. 30 minutes before the contract disappeared. Natalie finally glanced over her shoulder. Her eyes moved across the room until they stopped on me. A technician. No seat at the table. No title worth remembering. "Mr. Reed," she said. Her tone had that polished executive edge that meant the conversation was already over. "We are following the approved recovery procedure." Her hand gestured toward the screen where Senior VP David Chen was already initiating the system-wide reset protocol. "Your suggestion," she continued, "is not part of the standard operating procedure." I opened my mouth to explain, but she cut me off. "No." Just that one word again. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room understood exactly what it meant. David Chen smirked slightly beside her. "With respect," he said, not sounding respectful at all, "this system is far too complex for quick improvisations." Some of the board members nodded. Corporate language always sounded safer than instinct. I felt the familiar pressure settle on my shoulders, the same pressure that had pushed me out of rooms like this 7 years earlier. Back then, I used to run engineering departments. Back then, people listened when I spoke. Back then, I had a title that mattered. But that life disappeared the year my wife Anna got sick, when hospital rooms replaced boardrooms, when deadlines stopped meaning anything compared to the quiet sound of a breathing machine. After Anna was gone, I walked away from the executive floor without hesitation. Stock options, corner office, travel schedules, all of it, because my daughter Maya was 8 years old now. And she had already lost one parent. She wasn't going to lose another one to a job, so I rebuilt my life smaller, simpler, predictable, contract technician. Clock in early, clock out by 4, pick Maya up from school, dinner together, homework at the kitchen table. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Which meant arguing with CEOs about engineering decisions wasn't something I planned to do today, so I stepped back. "I understand," I said. Natalie had already turned away. Her focus was on the giant screen again. "Proceed with the reset," she ordered. David Chen nodded confidently. "Reset sequence beginning." Across the room, engineers rushed into motion. Commands flew across keyboards. Diagnostic windows multiplied. Massive computing resources began reallocating for the system reboot. The procedure was perfectly documented. Every step approved. Every action safe. At least on paper. But something about the error pattern bothered me. I didn't move closer to the console. Natalie had already made it clear I wasn't allowed near it. Instead, I leaned against the window and watched the logs scroll past. Numbers, time stamps, signal feedback loops. Most people were staring at the error messages, but error messages lie. Machines tell the truth through patterns, and patterns have rhythm. I pulled the small notebook from my pocket. It was worn, soft around the edges. Maya had drawn a crooked little rocket ship on the inside cover with a purple crayon months ago. She had written underneath it in careful block letters, "For Dad's smart ideas." I smiled for half a second, then I started writing. 11:04:12, 11:05:20, 11:06:28. Each major fault appeared exactly 68 seconds apart. Not random, not software chaos. A heartbeat. I looked back at the screen. Another warning flashed. Exactly 68 seconds later. That wasn't code behavior, that was hardware, a feedback cycle. I leaned slightly closer to the console area where a young engineer named Chris was sweating over the system diagnostics. "The lock isn't digital," I told him quietly. He didn't look up. "It's coming from a power feedback loop." Now he looked at me. His eyes were tired, frustrated, and very clearly annoyed. "The power systems are isolated," he snapped. "Triple surge protected." He pointed back at the screens. "This is a synchronization bug." I nodded slowly. "Not a bug," I said, "a pulse." He shook his head immediately. "Please step back, Mr. Reed." The words were polite. The message was. Behind us, David Chen was issuing faster and louder instructions. "Increase reset resources. Stabilize thermal load. Stay with the protocol." But the server racks had started humming differently, deeper, like a machine under physical strain. The room temperature was rising, and the red warnings were spreading into other systems now. The countdown clock showed 11 minutes remaining. I looked at the thick auxiliary power conduits running along the wall, then at the door leading to the secondary power room, then back to the screen. Another error spike hit, exactly 68 seconds again. My chest tightened. I knew that rhythm. I had heard it before, 7 years ago, when this entire power architecture was first installed. Because the truth was, I hadn't just worked on this system, I had helped design it, and the flaw I was seeing right now was something only one person in this building would recognize. The digital timer dropped to 10 minutes. Across the room, Natalie Voss gripped the conference table with white knuckles while the system continued sliding toward failure. And suddenly, I understood something that made my stomach sink. This wasn't a software crash. It was a physical power feedback, and if it continued another few minutes, the entire building could lose power, including the backup grid connected to half the financial district. I looked at the clock, then at Maya's drawing inside my notebook, then back at the servers, and a single thought settled in my mind. If I waited for permission, everyone in this room was about to watch their entire system collapse, so I made a decision. I was going to fix it, even if the CEO had already told me no. But the real question wasn't whether I could solve the problem. The real question was, what would happen when Natalie Voss realized I had ignored her order? I didn't move right away. Ignoring a CEO's direct order inside a room full of executives wasn't something you did casually. Careers ended for less. But the system humming behind those server racks didn't care about careers. Machines only cared about physics, and physics was screaming at me. Another fault warning exploded across the screen, right on schedule, 68 seconds again. I watched the timestamp appear and felt the quiet certainty settle deeper in my chest. The rhythm hadn't changed, which meant the reset procedure wasn't touching the real problem. Across the room, David Chen wiped sweat from his forehead. "Thermal load rising," someone shouted. "Reset resources maxed out." Chen's voice came back louder. "Push the reset harder." That sentence alone told me everything. You can't push electricity harder. You either stop the current or you don't. Natalie stood perfectly still at the center table. From a distance she looked calm, but I noticed the small signs most people missed. The rigid posture, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the desk, the tension behind her eyes. She knew the procedure wasn't working, but backing down now meant admitting she'd made the wrong call. Executives weren't trained to do that. Another error spike hit the screen. The server racks answered with a deeper vibrating hum. Someone near the cooling system cursed under his breath. "The temperature is climbing." A wave of murmurs spread through the engineers. The reset sequence was supposed to stabilize the system. Instead, it was feeding the failure. I flipped another page in my notebook. Maya's purple rocket peeked from the inside cover again. She had drawn it while sitting at our kitchen table one evening. "Dad," she had asked, "do computers get sick?" I had laughed, "Sometimes." "Then how do you make them feel better?" "You listen to them," I told her. "Machines talk." "They do if you're patient." She had thought about that for a moment before nodding seriously. "Then you're a doctor for computers." The memory lingered just long enough to steady my nerves. Another 68-second pulse appeared. That made 9 cycles, 9 confirmations. Enough. The cause was clear now. A tiny feedback surge on the auxiliary power line. Too small for normal surge protection, but just large enough to trick the new logic board into thinking it was receiving shutdown commands. Every 68 seconds. A digital panic triggered by a physical pulse. The solution was simple, painfully simple. Interrupt the tertiary shunt for a few seconds. Let the logic board reset naturally. Then restore power. 2 minutes of work, maybe less. I glanced toward the side corridor. The door to the auxiliary power room was half hidden behind a stack of equipment cases. No one was watching it. Everyone's attention was glued to the screens. Another alarm burst through the room. The main trading interface just entered protective lockdown. The countdown clock dropped to 8 minutes. David Chen swore loudly. "Client interface is down." Natalie's voice cut through the noise. "Stay on the reset sequence." Her tone was sharper now, faster, but still locked inside the rulebook. Chen leaned toward her urgently. "We may need to request a delay." The words sounded desperate. A delay meant admitting failure to the client, a billion-dollar failure. Natalie didn't answer, but her silence said enough. That option terrified her. Another pulse, another error, 68 seconds. The server racks vibrated harder. The overhead lights flickered once, just a tiny blink. Most people didn't notice. I did. Because that flicker didn't come from software, it came from electricity. And electricity doesn't lie. My stomach tightened. The feedback loop was growing stronger, which meant the auxiliary generator was building pressure. If that spike crossed a certain threshold, the backup grid could trip, not just this room, the entire building, maybe more. I walked slowly toward the console area again. Chris was still hunched over the diagnostics. "Listen," I said quietly. "The power shunt in the auxiliary room is pulsing." He didn't even look up this time. "We are not touching power systems," he said sharply. "That's outside the scope of this recovery." Scope, procedure. Layers of corporate safety designed to stop people from thinking. I exhaled slowly. There was no point arguing, not anymore. The clock dropped to 6 minutes, and then it happened. The lights flickered again, this time longer. A ripple of tension spread through the room. Someone whispered, "That's not good." Chen's voice cracked slightly. "Power stability warning." Natalie stared at the screen like she could force the system to obey her through sheer will. "We stay with the reset," she said. But the words sounded thinner now. Even she knew the truth. The procedure had lost control of the situation. I checked the time again. 5 minutes left. I thought about Maya waiting on the marble bench in the lobby downstairs. Her backpack always slid halfway off her shoulder. She liked sitting near the big glass windows because she said the sunlight made the building feel less serious. She always asked me the same question when I arrived. "Were you on time, Daddy?" Not "Did you win?" Not "Did you finish your work?" Just that, "Were you there?" The room erupted again. Cooling system overload. Another alarm blared. The lights flickered violently this time. Chen grabbed Natalie's arm. "The grid is destabilizing." Natalie's jaw tightened. "Keep the reset going." But her eyes shifted, for the first time since the crisis began. She looked at me, really looked. I could see the calculation happening behind her expression. She remembered the moment earlier when I had spoken, when I had said the reset wouldn't work. For half a second, doubt cracked through her certainty. I stepped forward. "Miss Voss." The room went quiet again. Everyone knew what had happened earlier. Everyone expected the same answer. No, I spoke calmly. The feedback pulse is coming from the tertiary shunt on the auxiliary power line. Chen scoffed immediately. That's impossible. It's happening every 68 seconds, I continued. Interrupting it will stop the synchronization failure. Natalie stared at me. Her mind was trapped between two impossible choices. Break protocol or watch the system collapse. Chen shook his head urgently. He's guessing. I held her gaze. I'm not. Another pulse hit. The overhead lights strobed violently. A collective gasp filled the room. The server racks roared like an engine under stress. 4 minutes remaining. Natalie opened her mouth, and I knew what she was about to say. No. Again, but this time something inside me refused to wait for the word, because I had already seen the ending of this situation. And if the next 68-second pulse arrived before the power loop stopped, the entire system would shut down permanently, maybe the entire building. I closed my notebook. Maya's little rocket stared up at me. Then I made the decision that would either save Astrocore or get me fired before sunset. I turned toward the auxiliary corridor and walked out of the operations room without permission. But the moment the door closed behind me, I realized something far more dangerous than losing my job. If I was wrong about the shunt, I wasn't just risking the system. I might shut down the entire power grid myself. The door closed behind me with a quiet click. Inside the operations room, alarms were still screaming. Out here in the auxiliary corridor, everything felt strangely calm. Cool air, concrete walls, the low electrical hum of machines doing their work. For a moment I just stood there listening, not to the alarms, to the building. Most engineers trust monitors. I trust vibration. And the vibration in the floor told me I had already waited too long. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't a sound most people could hear. But when you spend enough years around electrical systems, you start recognizing patterns the way musicians recognize rhythm. 68 seconds, that same pulse. It was stronger here, more physical. The kind of electrical stutter that travels through copper before it ever shows up in software logs. I walked down the narrow corridor toward the auxiliary power room. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because I doubted the diagnosis. I didn't. But because I knew exactly what would happen if anyone saw me inside that room. Unauthorized access to power infrastructure during a crisis. Best case scenario, I would be fired. Worst case scenario, they would assume sabotage. My hand hovered near the steel door. Behind it sat the tertiary shunt system. The tiny piece of legacy hardware no one in that operations room even remembered existed, except me. Because 7 years earlier, I had approved its installation. Back when I still had a corner office upstairs. Back when people called me sir. I pushed the door open. The auxiliary room was dim and quiet. Rows of electrical cabinets lined the walls. Heavy cables as thick as my wrist ran across the ceiling. The smell of warm copper filled the air. For a moment I just listened again. Tick, tick, tick. There it was, the pulse, perfectly timed. I walked toward the main distribution board. The large gray metal panel vibrated faintly beneath my fingertips. That vibration traveled straight into my bones. And right there behind the third junction panel was the culprit, the tertiary shunt box. A small rectangular housing most engineers would never even notice. It had been installed years ago as a bypass protection line, a physical workaround for a flaw in the original power system. Back then, it had been harmless. The old logic boards filtered the microcurrent automatically, but the new high-speed boards Astrocore installed last year were too sensitive. They were interpreting the tiny feedback pulse as a shutdown signal, a whisper of electricity being mistaken for a scream. Every 68 seconds, I checked the small indicator light on the panel, the faintest flicker, right on rhythm, confirmation. My chest loosened slightly. I wasn't wrong, but the next step still carried risk. Interrupting a live power shunt during a cascading failure wasn't something you practiced in textbooks. You either understood the system, or you caused a blackout. I glanced at the digital clock mounted on the wall. 3 minutes left. Inside the operations room, they were probably preparing the final stage of the reset, which meant the servers were about to pull even more power from the grid. That surge would amplify the feedback loop. The next pulse might be the one that collapsed everything. I crouched down in front of the panel. The breaker I needed wasn't large. It was barely the size of a finger. A secondary circuit branch designed to isolate the bypass line in emergency conditions. It had probably never been touched since the day we installed it. My hand hovered over the switch. For the first time since this crisis began. I hesitated, because in that quiet moment another memory appeared, not of engineering, of Maya. She had been sitting on the marble bench in the lobby that morning, swinging her legs while finishing her math homework. When I walked past her on the way to the elevator, she looked up and smiled. "Dad." "Yeah, kiddo. Are you fixing computers today or saving the world?" I laughed, "Probably just computers." She thought about that seriously. Then she said something that stayed with me all day. "Well, try to come back early anyway." That was Maya, simple priorities. She didn't care about contracts or CEOs or corporate procedures. She just wanted her dad home on time. I took a slow breath, then placed my fingers on the breaker. Tick. The vibration pulsed through the panel again, right on schedule. Another cycle beginning, which meant the next spike would hit the system in about 60 seconds if I interrupted the shunt at exactly the right moment. The logic boards would experience a clean electrical silence, just long enough to reset the synchronization loop. But if I mistimed it, the surge could jump into the main grid. The entire building would go dark. I looked at the breaker, then at the clock. 2 minutes remaining. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text message from Maya. "Did you save the world yet?" I smiled despite the tension, then typed back quickly, "Working on it." I slipped the phone away and focused. Machines aren't unpredictable, people are. Electricity always follows rules. You just have to respect them. Tick. The vibration came again, stronger this time. The system was reaching its limit. This was the moment. I tightened my grip on the breaker and pulled. The switch clicked softly, a tiny sound, barely louder than a fingernail tapping metal. But in that instant, the entire building seemed to hold its breath. The vibration vanished. The auxiliary line went silent. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the lights above me flickered once. Hard. The kind of flicker that makes your stomach drop, because if they didn't stabilize, everything upstairs was about to crash. I stood there staring at the panel. 1 second, 2, 3. The humming machines around me shifted pitch, not louder, smoother. The dangerous vibration never returned. I exhaled slowly. It worked. But the real test wasn't down here. It was upstairs, where a room full of executives was probably staring at a screen that had just gone completely silent. And if the system didn't restart cleanly in the next few seconds, my 2-second decision would go down as the moment Astrocore lost everything. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. No alarms, no voices, no movement, just silence. The kind of silence that makes people stop breathing without realizing it. I stood in the auxiliary power room staring at the panel, waiting for the building to decide whether I had saved it or killed it. Then the hum returned. But this time it was different, smooth, balanced, healthy. The dangerous vibration was gone. I didn't celebrate. Engineers don't celebrate until the system proves it's stable. So I closed the panel, turned around, and walked back toward the operations room. The hallway felt longer now. Every step echoed in the quiet corridor. When I pushed open the door, the scene inside looked like a photograph frozen in time. No one was speaking. No one was moving. Every person in the room was staring at the massive wall screen. The red error messages were gone, not erased. Gone. In their place, lines of green system confirmations were appearing one after another. Synchronization restored. Trading interface stable. Thermal load normalizing. The countdown clock still hung above the screens. 2 minutes and 17 seconds remained. The system had recovered. and the entire room seemed to be trying to process the same impossible question at once. How? Senior VP David Chen was the first person to move. He slowly lowered himself into a chair like his legs had stopped working. Someone near the back of the room whispered, "It's fixed." Natalie Voss was still standing at the center table. Her hands rested on the edge of the console. Her eyes were locked on the screen. But then she turned and looked directly at me. For the first time that day, the icy certainty in her expression was gone. What replaced it was something far more human: shock, understanding, and something else: regret. I walked calmly back toward the server bank and leaned against the console like nothing unusual had happened. The silence in the room stretched until Natalie finally spoke. "What did you do?" Her voice was quiet, not angry, not commanding, just honest. I held up my notebook slightly. "The synchronization failure wasn't software," I said. "It was power feedback from the tertiary shunt on the auxiliary generator." A few engineers leaned forward immediately. I continued. "The new logic boards interpret that microcurrent as a shutdown signal. Every 68 seconds the board received a false command and locked itself again." I nodded toward the servers. "I isolated the shunt for 2 seconds so the board could reset without the signal." The room stayed silent, processing. Then one of the younger engineers spoke. "But that shunt shouldn't affect the system at all." I gave a small shrug. "It didn't 7 years ago." A few people exchanged confused looks. David Chen slowly lifted his head. "How did you even know that bypass existed?" he asked hoarsely. "It's not in the current system schematics." I met his gaze calmly. "Because I designed the original power integration." The words landed like a weight in the center of the room. Confusion turned into realization, and realization turned into something close to embarrassment. Chen blinked. What?" 7 years ago," I said quietly, before I stepped away. Someone near the board table whispered. "He was the VP of engineering." That whisper spread through the room like a ripple. Natalie's expression changed again. The pieces were finally connecting. The quiet contractor, the technician no one listened to, the man standing in the corner, the man who had just saved the entire system. She slowly walked toward me. Each step careful, measured. When she stopped in front of me, the entire room watched, because moments earlier she had publicly shut me down with one word: no. Now she took a breath and said something far harder: "I was wrong." The admission echoed softly through the operations room. For a CEO, it was probably the most difficult sentence she had spoken in years. "You saved the launch," she continued, "and the company." I nodded once. "You're welcome." I didn't say it proudly, just factually, because the truth was, the praise didn't really matter to me. Natalie studied me for a moment longer. Then she turned toward the stunned executives behind her. "Effective immediately," she said, her voice returning to its steady authority. "We are initiating a complete review of our crisis decision protocols." She gestured slightly toward me. "Expert insight will no longer be dismissed simply because it isn't documented." No one argued. No one dared, because the green system status glowing behind her was proof enough. The billion-dollar contract was secure, the system was stable, and the technician they ignored had solved the problem in less than 2 minutes. The tension in the room finally broke. Engineers started talking again. Phones buzzed. People exhaled the stress they had been holding for half an hour. But I checked the time. 4:01 p.m. I picked up my notebook and slipped it back into my pocket. Then I started walking toward the door. Natalie noticed. "Daniel," she said. I stopped. "I'd like to discuss your future with Astrocore." I turned slightly. "I appreciate that," I said, but my shift ended. A few people chuckled nervously. Natalie blinked. "You're leaving?" "Yes." "Now?" I nodded. "My daughter is waiting." For a moment she looked like she might argue. Then something softened in her expression. She understood. Because saving a billion-dollar contract might matter to a company, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as an 8-year-old girl waiting on a marble bench. Natalie stepped aside. Go. I nodded once more and walked out of the operations room. No applause, no speeches, just the quiet sound of my footsteps echoing down the hallway. The elevator ride down was peaceful. By the time the doors opened into the lobby, the late afternoon sun was pouring through the glass walls. Maya was exactly where she always sat, feet swinging, homework spread across the bench. When she saw me, her entire face lit up. Daddy. She ran over and wrapped her arms around my waist. You're on time. I hugged her back tightly. Always. She looked up at me with bright, curious eyes. So. Her voice lowered like she was sharing a secret. Did you save the world today? I laughed softly. Not really. What did you do then? I thought about the boardroom, the panic, the flashing red screens, the silence when everything stopped, and then the moment the system finally breathed again. Just fixed a bad wire, I told her. Maya considered that answer very seriously. Then she nodded. Good. She took my hand, and together we walked out of the massive glass tower into the warm evening sunlight. Behind us, executives were probably still discussing strategy and recovery protocols, but none of that mattered anymore, because some victories aren't measured in contracts, or titles, or boardroom applause. Some victories are measured in quiet moments like this, walking home with your daughter, on time. And sometimes the strongest answer in the world isn't power. It's knowing exactly what truly matters.